Roger Griffiths here, the publisher of The Hub. Welcome to this, the first of our Election 2025 shows. We're going to bring you our best experts and thinkers on the program today. We've got Ginny Roth, Hub contributor and VP at Crestview, and my wingman, Sean Spear, co-founder. Guys, how do we find you today?
Great. I am so honored to be the first guest on this inaugural live stream. It's exciting.
Yeah, Sean, great to see you. I want to start because both of you share a distinction that I don't, which is you have worked on campaigns. You know what it's like to be in the war room on day one. So Ginny, let me come to you first. We'll go around the horn in terms of the campaigns. What is the Pierre Poilievre campaign hoping to accomplish on day one? How do you think about day one? What are you trying to do?
So I like to think about the days, and they are days, right? In broadcast days before social media, this sort of 24-hour day concept was really dominant. You know, in a war room, you'd watch the nightly broadcast on the news and say, like, how do we do? You know, how do we stack up? Did we get attacked? Did we get our message out? And that is still, I think, broadly true. You want to take stock every 24 hours or so and say, did we win the day? Because if you win enough days, you win the campaign, which is generally how it works. Yeah. And so I think there's one of the great tests for asking yourself if you won the day is, what was the frame? Did you set the frame for the conversation on your terms? And good evidence for that is if your opponent is stepping into your frame, if they're having to explain themselves based on the frame that you want. And so early in the campaign, you're trying to set the frame for the whole election. And I think you saw that with Poilievre's sort of adjusted slogan, let's say, Canada first for a change, yeah. Right? And you can see what kind of frame he's trying to drive, a change frame. And you saw Carney, trying to drive a frame about serious leadership in tough times. He wants the campaign to be about Trump, certainly. Taking stock of it, I think Poilievre was in a pretty good spot yesterday. We'll see how today goes. They've already tried to set their frame this morning, I think.
Yeah. Okay, Sean, let me come to you. You got some scars from a few war rooms in your life. Looking at day one, give us your sense. We got a bit of dueling tax cuts here. It seemed to be the big message out of the gate. Any surprise there? Any compare and contrast that's got your attention?
No, I agree with what Jenny said. I'm especially pleased that the Poilievre campaign ultimately settled on an aspirational and positive narrative around the promise of Canada. It's always felt to me, Roger, like it's the one that's most natural for him. It's most connected to his own personal narrative and, of course, the narrative of his wife. And I think it's one that resonates with Canadians of different political backgrounds, different ethnic backgrounds, those who've been in the country for a long time and those who've just arrived. The campaign has clearly, over the past several months, experimented with different ways to think and talk about itself, and I'm glad that it's finally come home in a way to this narrative about social mobility and the promise of Canada. On the subject of tax cuts, I like tax cuts, and so a world in which the different parties are fighting over who's going to give me more of my money, I think that's a pretty good outcome. I would say, though, Roger, that personal income tax cuts in the past have had pretty low political salience. Most people don't know what their marginal rates are. There's the interaction between the federal rate and the provincial rate. And so in some ways, what I see happening over the past 24 hours or so is major announcements essentially canceling each other out. One party has a tax cut, the other party has a tax cut. And so I think what's going to matter is the next few days, do the Conservatives start to put forward ideas that in a way challenge people? We know that they're in favor of liberalizing the rules around resource development. We know they're in favor of cutting taxes for middle income earners. I think tomorrow and the days that follow, it'll be interesting to see if we see something new and different and a way to kind of challenge people's intuitions about Pierre Poilievre and the Conservative Party.
So, Ginny, one of the big things we've seen from the Liberals is this big about face, a kind of rejection of a lot of the Trudeau era policies, and in a sense, an adoption, a lot of the Conservative agenda. What happens in a campaign? Like, how do you deal with that when your opponent is basically taking all the ideas that you've been out there for months, prosecuting the case on, and then pulling them into their campaign?
Yeah, liberal shamelessness is hard to hold fast, is quite brazen. Well, first of all, I think you don't let that narrative set in, actually. Like, I think Poilievre needs to not repeat that Carney's stealing his policies. If, in fact, I think he needs to point to where there's difference. And I think Sean was getting at this a little bit with the idea that Poilievre should have interesting ideas that Carney hasn't thought of and has to sort of try to keep up with and maybe can't. And there are areas where, Carney is straddling quite a broad spectrum of ideology, let's say, right now. A big part of his growth for the Liberal number is coming from the NDP, clearly. The NDP and the Bloc, I think. And so, emissions cap, we've already seen Carney has had to clarify that he is still in favor of the emissions cap, which is essentially a cap on growth, a cap on jobs. We all believe this. And that is an area where I think he's decided I can't move on this. It's too inconsistent with my, decade of advocacy on climate policy. It would alienate NDP voters that I need to win, because he needs an NDP collapse for the Liberals to be successful. I think he should be really challenged on some of the foreign policy areas like Israel, where we know his coalition is very divided. I would be looking for pushing him really hard to pick a side on some of these key areas and really rejecting the premise that they're competing. And the reason I like the emissions cap piece is if both Carney and Poilievre are saying the way to grow the economy is to cut taxes and get government out of the way, well, the emissions cap gets government right in your face and stops projects, stops growth, So, I would be looking for a long list of examples of where Carney's actions and policy flies in the face of this idea that he's some kind of business liberal out of nowhere.
Sean, what do you...
Ginny, isn't there a role... I was just going to jump in. Isn't there a role on that point, Ginny, for local candidates? Typically, we spend a lot of time focused on the national campaign, and for good reason. But across the country, we're going to have Liberal incumbent MPs who've been saying and doing things for a past decade and are now going to be running on a campaign that amounts to reversing themselves on a series of issues. In a decentralized campaign fought across 338 ridings, isn't there an opportunity for local Conservative candidates to, in effect, challenge the Liberal opponents and possibly get them on the record saying things that conflict with the message and narrative that Mark Carney's trying to advance at the national level?
Yeah, Sean, you and I know some of the people in the Conservative war room, and I don't think they'll shy away from trying to encourage their candidates to drive that wedge. And the wedge you pick will depend on what the riding's like. If you are in a downtown Toronto riding as a Liberal and you're fighting it out with a New Democrat who maybe has a strong ground game, even if Singh is weaker on the national stage. If I'm the Conservative, I'm pushing that Liberal to commit to every business Liberal idea in the book, right? And try to alienate voters on the left. If I'm a Conservative competing with a Liberal in the GTA in a GTA seat where it's Conservative versus Liberal, I'm going to make them wear every crazy kooky left-wing idea that Carney's ever committed to and the Liberals have ever proposed. And so that, you're right, Sean, that forced choice, maybe even to the benefit of the Bloc in Quebec, where Carney's got a bit of a boost, but will be in a tough spot when his French isn't up to snuff. As I understand it, he hasn't committed to the TVA debate, which is sort of the notoriously difficult French debate in Quebec. And so as that plays out over the course of 5 weeks or so, hopefully you if you're a Conservative, you narrow that appeal that he has on both sides, from the left and the right.
Right. Just reminding viewers that we do have a live chat going, and we will go to your questions through the course of this program, our inaugural edition of the Hub's YouTube effort. We're going to be here every day for you at 10 a.m. with, again, as you can tell, some of our best thinkers and commentators. Sean, I want to come to you just as we begin to wrap up and go to our second guest. The NDP, really critical here. Their numbers have collapsed to lows that are kind of historically abnormal. What's your sense here? What does Jagmeet Singh have to do to resurrect some of the fortunes of his party? He's got 36 days. He's got some runway. What's your recommendation?
It's interesting, isn't it, Rudyard? Up until now, Jagmeet Singh has pulled his punches on Mark Carney, and we can speculate maybe in a minute about what would explain that. But on the face of it, Mark Carney represents a perfect type of Liberal leader for the New Democrats, doesn't he? One with a lot of ties to big business. Goldman Sachs, for goodness sakes, in a way, the kind of symbol of
I think it was called, Sean, the Vampire Squid, the Giant Vampire Squid by Matt Taibbi. This is a guy who's been in the belly of the giant vampire squid.
Precisely. And one could argue his signature policy in the past week is reversing the Trudeau government's class warfare politics and reversing the tax hike on capital gains. For all of those reasons, the New Democrats should be able to litigate the case that they're the only true progressive party in this campaign. If they can do that effectively, they should be able to push their vote up in a way that potentially creates splits in some of the key ridings for the Conservatives. What worries me a bit, though, Roger, is that Jagmeet Singh isn't looking at the immediacy of this election campaign. He's thinking about its aftermath and the potential for the New Democrats to enter into some type of governing arrangement with the Liberals. And I think that, in a way, will be at the back of his mind when he's making these judgments about how far to lean in and go after Carney on what ought to be a series of vulnerabilities vis-a-vis the New Democrats.
Yeah, I agree with Sean, although I think that's flawed logic on the part of Singh, because if they do poorly enough, if I'm Carney, I'm looking at the Bloc as a dance partner. The Bloc increasingly is a left separatist party, or center-left separatist party, depends on the day. They're sort of populist, it depends on the issue. They're certainly not right of center the way you might have thought that they would have once been. And so if the NDP are reduced enough, if I'm Carney, I'm saying, like, I don't need you as a dance party. I don't, they would not necessarily have the control and sway over a Carney liberal plurality the way they would over a Trudeau plurality, I don't think. And so I think that would be foolish. Sean may be right. That may be ultimately what they're thinking. I actually think the thing that drives it is a bit more simplistic than that, which is they want to stop conservatives. They have a very anti-conservative worldview and ethos, and the remaining rump of their activists and supporters and members and volunteers will they're very susceptible to an argument that you ought to help the Liberals win to stop the Conservatives.
But does this, for an NDP voter, I guess what I struggle with is, we're talking Carney's in support. We'll see. It depends on what language he's speaking and where he is in the country. But it seems like he's in support of an energy corridor. He's in support of pipelines. He's in support of what sounds like a kind of pro-business approach and philosophy towards the economy. I thought these things were just antithetical to NDP voters.
Well, and to your point, he's a banker. I think actually the class cultural difference piece should be, if you're an NDP strategist, you should be ruthless enough to say, I'm going to play hardball with this guy. And you do, to give them some credit, you do see some digital ads coming out that talk about his past, talk about the roles he's played. They've been talking about, for instance, Brookfield's role supporting commercial landlords and their relationship to tenants and that sort of thing. I'd be pushing really, really hard on that. And we'll see if they do. They are a little bit, and they'll probably target those ads to the ridings where they're competing with the Liberals in downtown. And I just worry that they need to appear to have some momentum. Voters need to believe that voting for them will have meaning and so they need to drive the idea that they can play a role in a potential coalition government. They'll push hard, and the more seats they win, the more they can do that.
Okay.
Roger, do I have time to sneak one more in?
Yeah. We got lots of time.
Ginny, I just want to ask about ground game. You're a much more experienced campaigner than I am. Is it of any significance that the three major parties, but particularly the Liberals, entered this campaign without a full slate of candidates? If you're a voter in one of the ridings where the Liberals haven't yet bothered to nominate a candidate, will that in any way influence your judgment about how the party values your vote, how responsive it is to local issues? Do you think there's any risk for the Liberals that they've pulled the trigger on this campaign before they were fully prepared to have candidates from coast to coast to coast?
Yeah, there's definitely a risk. I don't know that it's so much what the message it sends to a voter as it is just the practical and logistical challenges. Like a local campaign, any campaign, is about the deployment of resources. You have money and you have time. And any campaign manager will tell you time is more valuable than money. And the way you deploy that time to win more votes, knock on more doors, make more contact, make more calls, make more fundraising calls, you have less time the later you're nominated. Some of these conservative candidates have been nominated for more than a year. And they've been pounding the pavement, IDing vote that they can then GOTV in the lead up to election day and for advanced polls. That is a huge advantage. And the message doesn't matter that advantage. It's just about work. And there's you have to get your filing in so that your name can be on the ballot. There are all kinds of logistical challenges that if you're an organization, you're not worried about the frame that day or the message. You are just driving against these deadlines where you're deploying time and money against a ticking clock. And any delay in getting a candidate nominated hurts that.
Yeah. Well, Ginny Roth, thank you so much for coming on the inaugural edition of Election 2025. We're so fortunate to have you as a contributor here at the Hub, and also for you bravely signing up to be part of our regular YouTube.
I think I'll come back. I survived. I think I'll come
We'd
back.
love to have you back. So yeah, thanks so much for coming on. Well, Sean, our first big interview down. Let's take one live question now coming in from our audience. Just to remember to all our viewers, jump into the chat and let's get your thoughts. We'll get Sean to answer this. Bill's asking, is reversing policies hypocrisy or listening to the voters and adapting to a changing environment?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. And Mark Carney obviously will make the case for the latter point of view. In fact, he's argued that while he broadly supports carbon taxation, he recognizes it's become divisive and an impediment to progress on the climate file, and that's the logic behind moving off it. I think the challenge, though, Rudyard, is just the kind of dogmatic case that the Liberals have made for a lot of these policies over the past decade. Think of Chrystia Freeland, for instance, who's running for re-election in Toronto Rosedale. Remember the lines of arguments that she deployed in favor of the capital gains tax increase just over a year ago. I mean, she, for all intents and purposes, said that anyone who opposed the tax increase were insensitive to the interests of children and babies. And so I think that probably is the challenge for the Liberals, is that there's this long track record of not just making prudent or dispassionate arguments in favor of some of these policies. They've, for all intents and purposes, argued that anyone who was opposed to them were either climate denialists or insensitive, as I say, to the interests of low-income Canadians and so on and so forth. I think there's a pretty big body of evidence that the Conservatives are going to be able to draw upon to make the case that they're not just hypocrites, that in a way they're shapeshifters. They're prepared to say whatever it takes, no matter what, to get themselves elected.
Well, real pleasure now to bring on to the program for the back half our resident polling guru, Daryl Bricker, CEO of Ipsos Global Public Affairs and the co-host with Sean Speer of our rocketing podcast, Bricker and Speer, going up the charts. Political podcasts in Canada. Do not miss it. Check it out. Daryl, great to have you on the first program.
Well, it's great to be here. Thanks.
Well, Daryl, you have decades of polling experience when it comes to elections in Canada. Give us your temperature test. Day one of the campaign. What is this? The OK Corral, a Mexican standoff? I don't know. I want an analogy from you to explain the public opinion in the country right now as we kick off this historic election.
Well, it's clear the Liberals have momentum, which is why they've decided to have an election campaign that we're going through right now. But the way I would describe, I'm always thinking of analogies because I know Sean really likes them. So I'm trying to think of an analogy. And I'm going to just run this one by you.
Thank you.
The Liberal campaign to me is like the Hindenburg. Everybody remembers the Hindenburg, big airship full of helium going across to the United States from Germany. Back in the 1930s, and it hits a lightning storm, and all of a sudden the helium goes off, and it just hits the ground. And the humanity is the thing that everybody remembers about it. What they forget is that the Hindenburg actually got across the Atlantic successfully 30 times. But the Liberal campaign is like the Hindenburg. There's so much. I mean, as Jenny was going through, and you guys were going through in the last few minutes, that could go off for these guys, but they're just plowing into that thunderstorm. So the question is whether or not any of these sparks goes off and causes it to crash, because it's entirely contingent on one thing. By the way, I always enjoy the conversations about policy and all the rest of it. That's not really what this is about. This is about an election campaign that has moved from being about change to being about leadership. So the question is, on the narrow shoulders of Mark Carney rests the entire future of the Liberal Party up until the election campaign. So when any of those sparks go off, and they're inevitably going to go off, are they enough to cause ignition in the helium and to bring this thing down? Because I don't think it's like a little. If it goes off in the wrong way, it's going to come crashing down. The Pierre Poilievre campaign is a lot easier to understand. It's basically the MAGA North thing, and it's a very, very difficult thing for conservatives to do. And anytime the Liberals decide they want to resuscitate that point, it's a very easy thing to do. The comparison ad between Trump saying things and Poilievre saying things is very, very powerful. It is the significant vulnerability that he has. And as our polling showed, it is the one really big differentiator between Poilievre and Carney. Which one of these guys would roll over under pressure from Donald Trump? And I think the number for Mr. Carney was like 6, and it's 31 for Pierre. So they've got that anytime they want. So you're going to see these two things going through together through this election campaign, both focused on leadership, not on policy, about whether Mark Carney is who he appears to be, or he does have these vulnerabilities and the thing will go off, or if Pierre Poilievre is really Trump North and we don't want him as the prime minister of the country. So that's going to be the fight. I mean, you can talk about get out the vote camp, activities. Yes, that keeps the volunteers busy, and it's important to do that in a campaign. Yes, we can talk about policy, because what else would we talk about if, on conversations like this if we didn't? But the truth is, what we're really fighting over now is leadership, and whether Mark Carney is the man that he claims to be, genuinely and authentically, or if Pierre Poilievre is really a representation of something that Canadians are seeing south of the border and just a northern version. And that's what this campaign, at least at the start of it, is really about.
Well, let's seize on that, Daryl. We have roughly 6 weeks. What can or should Pierre Poilievre be doing over the 6 weeks to meet that test, to convince Canadians that he is reliable on the fundamental question of leadership?
Well, you've been seeing him doing it already. Now, the question is just whether or not it's going to work. So he's trying to push the conservative part of the campaign over to a discussion about policy. And if you take a look at the mood that he's been trying to generate in his rallies and when he's been presenting himself, it's not just a critical one. It's one of he occasionally has a smile on his face. He occasionally looks like he's excited about the future. Occasionally, he's trying to generate a more positive image. And I think that works well for him. On the Carney side, I think that what you're seeing him do is, I guess Jenny was saying previously, trying to take some of the better ideas from the Conservatives, but also probably going to take some better ideas from the Liberal Party. By the way, this is the Liberal Party. I mean, Justin Trudeau's dad did the same thing back in the 1970s around wage and price controls. I mean, we've seen this kind of behavior from the Liberals forever. This is what contagion from the left is all about. Political scientists would know what that means. But this idea that you would be a bit of a shapeshifter and you'd take whatever the best ideas were, you're not really an ideological party, and you're just going to try and present an offering during the context of an election campaign that's a consensus type of offer that's big enough for the public to buy into. So I think that's what Carney's trying to do all the time, trying to avoid those sparks. And Poilievre is trying to develop a more positive demeanor and trying to present substantive policies to force the Liberals to respond.
Talk to us, Daryl, about the NDP. The NDP support right now is well below the historic norms. If you go back and look at the last few elections, on election day, traditionally the NDP is a good 4, 5, 6 or more points higher than where they are at this moment. Should we expect a bit of a rebound for the NDP? And if we did, how would that benefit or hurt the Liberals and Conservatives?
Well, one of the things that's really emerged in Canada is that there's now a conservative voting coalition and there's a progressive voting coalition. And the progressive voting coalition is split between two parties. The conservative voting coalition is really split, is consolidated around one. That's what the big shift back in the 1990s through the 2000s really did. It created a single conservative movement. There's no longer a Western conservative movement, and there's no longer a kind of whole progressive conservative movement they've got together. It was interesting when the Prime Minister resigned a few weeks ago, that in his presentation, he didn't talk just about the Liberal Party, he talked about progressive voters. So the Liberal Brain Trust gets this. This is how Justin Trudeau won the elections that he did. He was able to sufficiently collapse the NDP vote so they didn't create the splits that work for the Conservatives the way that Sean was discussing. So the problem that the NDP's poor performance is creating is not just for the NDP, it's also for the Conservative Party, because they need the NDP to be better. But the one problem that the NDP seems to have at the moment is they have a leader who is not a politician. He doesn't seem to know. He doesn't seem to care about it.
Yeah, it's strange. I mean, why do you think even in the last few weeks, Jagmeet Singh has not been prosecuting any kind of case against Carney? He's been kind of MIA, frankly.
Yeah, he should have taken them down a year ago. If Jack Layton would have been the leader, he would have done it. And the reason, and it was clear to anybody who was looking at it, if you don't take them down now, you're giving them a year to, or up till October of this year, to get their act back together. You give them back the timing of the election campaign, and guess what? You may not be running against Justin Trudeau. And your best chance to get back on the agenda as the leader of the progressive movement in this country, like Jack Layton was, is to pass them in an election campaign. And he didn't do it. Yeah. So now he's stuck at 10%, at least in our polling. Maybe he'll go up a little bit. One of the things that we saw in the Ontario election, though, Richard, was that the NDP really underperformed the Liberals in the provincial election campaign, but won very many more seats. So even if they've got a more consolidated vote, it tends to be a pretty efficient vote.
Yeah.
Let me ask Daryl about a subject that we cover a lot on our biweekly show, and that is the political realignment. I note, for instance, that in the past several days, Pierre Poilievre has made major announcements flanked by trade union representatives, something that would have been unthinkable, less than a decade ago. The Conservative Party has ambitions on competing in working class strongholds through Northern Ontario, including my hometown of Thunder Bay, parts of the Maritimes, and working class parts of British Columbia. Is there a possibility here, Daryl, to add to the pre-existing Conservative coalition new and different voters, including those from the working class? And if so, what will you be looking for to see if this is indeed a political realignment election?
Yeah, in fact, that's what we are seeing. I mean, when you take a look at the polling right now, who's voting for the Liberal Party? Old people. Who's voting for the Conservative Party? Young people. Who's voting for the Liberal Party? Tend to be better educated. You get younger women more interested in voting for progressive options. But the better educated, the better established, the people who are trying to hold on to the Canada that they remember. And then on the other side, you've got the people who, for them, Canada's not working. And so that is a lot of working class voters. It really is interesting. It's completely flipped from the way that it used to be, where you would get a lot of kind of affluent, upper middle class people voting for the Conservative Party. No, they vote for the Liberals now. The Conservative Party is really plugged into this thing. When Pierre Poilievre says that Canada's not working, that group of people for whom it's not working, because they don't feel they can get the house that they should be living in, they don't feel secure in their job, all of their life feels precarious, they can't start the family they want to have, all of those things that they thought was the Canadian promise isn't working for them. When Pierre Poilievre says that, it has appeal. So I think that there is potential for realignment, definitely.
Well,
we're seeing that already.
Daryl, we are going to say goodbye to you because we're going to tire out your voice over the next 36 days. You very graciously offered to be our regular kind of polling impresario, to give us your 30-plus years of political experience looking at the polls. So fortunate to have you as part of the Hub's Daily YouTube and podcast on the 2025 election. Thank you so much, buddy.
It's a privilege. Thank you very much.
Well, that's going to wrap up our show today. I want to thank all of our listeners and viewers for tuning in. Sean, great to kick this off with you. I'm excited. I'm feeling good. I know you are too. The Hub is locked and loaded for this campaign, and we're going to enjoy engaging with our community and our listeners each and every day. So we're going to say goodbye now to our online audience, and hang around afterwards if you'd like your questions answered. If you're on the live chat, Sean and I are going to spend 5-10 minutes with you just going through some of the questions that have been put to our show. If you're listening to this on our podcast feed and you want to be part of the live stream, just head over to the Hub's YouTube page, Hub Canada on YouTube, and you can catch us each day live at 10 a.m. Eastern or on demand. Bye-bye.